Here's the story of how I restored my dad's old 1936 Chevy Truck. This video is going to cover the entire build, right from a decrepit shell all the way up to a fully functional running, driving truck that's street legal and finished. Now, this project has been in the works for a long time, longer than I've had a YouTube channel, longer than YouTube itself has existed, and actually longer than the World Wide Web has been around. So this all started way back in 1981 when my dad purchased this truck from the family that had bought it new in 1936. He paid $200 for it, and by the time he got it, there wasn't a whole lot left of the truck. The original chassis and engine and transmission and all that was long gone. It had been all dismantled. In order to get you all up to speed on this project here, we're going to have to take a look at some old pictures, but I promise you it won't be very long, and we'll be right back to modern video footage for the rest of the show. So here's what the truck looked like back in 1981 when my dad bought it, and they were in the process of trying to mount it on a 1958 Chevy truck frame, and there wasn't any chance in all the world that was ever going to work out. So the truck got set aside again. And fast forward to the mid 1990s, and my dad had acquired a International Scout chassis, and he was trying to get the body mounted on that, but that wasn't going to quite work out the way he wanted either. So the truck got dismantled again, and my 1966 GMC got moved in, and we were working on that. And so the truck just sat in the corner, all in pieces. The chassis got moved outside and eventually sold off. All the other parts got put up in the rafters, and it sat dormant like this for many years. Now, about 10 or 12 years ago, I managed to find a set of rear fenders for a 1936 Chevy truck. They were in very poor condition, so I set about trying to rebuild them. The whole lower rear section was missing, so I tried building my own out of sheet metal, and with a lot of hammering and fiddling around, I was eventually able to get it all to come together, and I was able to revive the old fenders. We got the passenger side done here, and then we started on the driver's side, which wasn't in much better shape, but we were able to get that piece together too. And then we finally found the missing piece of the puzzle, an original 1936 Chevy truck chassis. It's around this time my dad realized he wasn't going to get to the project, so he made a deal with me that if I did all the rust repair on his 1975 GMC, I would get the 36 Chevy in exchange. So here I am dragging the 36 Chevy home in the back of my 66 GMC and having a look at all the parts and pieces that I had acquired. And as with any massive project, I started by polishing up the paint on the cab. Good use of time, not really. Then I drug the chassis inside and began cutting off all the ugly brackets that had been welded onto it over the years. Got the cab mounted on the frame finally. Began test fitting all the pieces. And then I found a 1935 Chevy truck for sale. It was all in pieces, but it came with box sides and running boards and a few other bits. So I harvested the pieces I needed, bolted the rest of the 35 together, and sold it off to a nice fellow who was planning to build it into a street rod. Then the truck sat like this for several years. I had just put some axles under it so I could roll it around. And a lot of time it actually went into this cab getting it all squared away, because over the years it had been twisted and bent out of shape. Doors wouldn't close, nothing fit on it, so a lot of hours went into this cab to get it all squared back up and straightened back out. And then the truck again kind of sat dormant for several years, but around this time I started my YouTube channel and I needed some content. So I began repairing the front fenders, knocking all the dents out of them, and I wanted to repair them the same way that they might have been repaired back in the 1940s or 30s or 50s. The good old pre-Bondo days, as we call them in the biz. So I meticulously hammered and pecked away at the fenders, and once I had the dents kind of roughed in, I began using the body file, and then I had a giant crack here that had been poorly welded sometime in the past, so I set about repairing that. And I did cheat a little bit. I used a TIG welder for these repairs, as I don't have an oxyacetylene setup. But other than that, I tried to keep the repair as authentic as possible. And here we are repairing the edge. The next step was I had to cut out the rest of the ugly weld. The previous expert that worked on this had welded it together in the wrong spot. So here we are demonstrating the floppiness of the fender, and now I had to build the new body line. So I simply hammered that in with a chisel and a hammer, and then got that all spliced in. And now I'm building the rest of the patch, and here I am hammering some shape into it, and now we're getting it fit onto the fender here. And now it's been tack welded in place, and we're ready for final welding. I should mention that there is a 1936 Chevy playlist on this channel, so if you have any inquiries as to the tools or parts or methods that I'm using in this video, you can check out that playlist, and there's videos on the entire build in great painful detail, and hopefully they will answer all of your questions. I'm doing my best to narrate what's happening here, but I tend to forget things, and so your best bet is just to check out that playlist. And here I am again using the file to fine-tune the surface, and now we have this little patch here that my dad butchered out to fit this fender over the International Scout chassis. So thanks, Dad, for making some work for me. And now we're going to get all of this smoothed out here. So we're starting by grinding down the welds, and then I'm just going to beat the snot out of this for a while and fiddle around with it for an exceedingly long time. So just be glad that this is in fast forward. Another thing I should mention before we get too far into this video is from time to time you may see text flash across the screen, and it's too fast to see what it says, but please do not be alarmed. All of this footage was taken from existing videos, and I did my best to edit out most of that text from the screen, but I couldn't get all of it. And don't worry if you missed seeing it. It's no longer relevant to anything that's happening, and I will again do my best to narrate what's going on so that the text on the screen is not required. So once again, if you see text flashing across the screen, remain calm, just ignore it. Now here I am repairing some creases and dents that were caused by some cretin slamming the hood down into the sides of the fender. Basically every square inch of these fenders had damage in them somewhere that had to be worked out. It's quite a time-consuming process, but as we can see here by the final results, they're not perfect by any means, but they're certainly good enough for an old farm truck. Alright, well, this was the easy side, and now we get to move on to the passenger side. We had a big old dent right at the front here that I had already tried hammering out, but you can see it's still pretty wobbly, and there's dents everywhere on this fender. Dents, dents, dents. So I'll, again, continue hammering away here, working them out bit by bit. The blue tool you see me often using here is called a bullseye pick. Normally it comes with a very pointed tip, but I ground it down so it's flat, and it works good for bumping up minor low spots on the surface. And then I use a sanding block to check my progress. I continue working over this panel, again just doing small amounts at a time. And once I have it 99% there, I switch over to a body file to fine-tune the surface. And now we're going to begin fixing the other flap that my dad butchered into these fenders. I had already previously welded this, but it still required all the fine-tuning to get it smooth out. Coming up in a moment is my cat, Alan. He is an orange cat. Now we're finishing out this seam, and I polished it up for some reason so you could see that the little flap is gone, and the surface is now ready for primer and paint. Now we're beginning to work on this area here. This area is cracked and poorly welded and smashed, and I had already hammered out some of the damage years ago off of camera, off of YouTube. But there is still much work to be done here, so I began by grinding down the choppy welds so that I could hammer this out a little bit easier. And once I got those nasty welds knocked down, then I was able to start straightening out the edge some more, as you can see by the text on the screen. The edges are always the hardest part of these fenders to get straight, but it's the most important part, because if you don't get those straight, then the rest of your work is in vain. So here it looks like I'm bondoing up the fender, and it is true I am, but what I'm doing here is I'm creating a pattern or a smooth surface to take a pattern from, I guess. This bondo will not be staying, but I needed a smooth surface so that I could get an accurate pattern off of it, and I used paper for making my patterns. And I cut little slots in the paper to determine where I need to shrink the metal. Once I'm satisfied with that, I transfer the pattern over onto a piece of 18 gauge sheet metal, and then I began shrinking using a tucking fork and a hammer and stump to hammer metal into itself and therefore shrink it. And now here's my cat Poe. I just thought I'd throw that in there. Poe is a very good cat. Now we're back to shrinking some more. This takes a while doing it all by hand, but it does work. Once I felt I had done enough shrinking, I took it over to the sandbag and used a mallet to stretch out the center. Basically just beating the ever-loving life out of it, and I'm left with a lumpy mess of garbage. But don't worry, we're gonna smooth it all out. Use the English wheel. Watching somebody use the English wheel is about as mesmerizing as watching paint dry. But all you paint drying enthusiasts, don't worry. We'll have some paint drying footage further on in the video here, but for now, you're just going to have to watch me ruin this panel with the English wheel. I don't know about you, but this is getting awfully boring, so here's some footage of Poe being a little bit sassy. Don't worry though, she's still a good cat. After that first round of English wheeling, there wasn't quite enough shape in it, so here I am beating the snot out of it again, using the mallet and sandbag. Now we're smoothing all that out again. I find I usually have to do this a few times to get the panel exactly where I want it to be. It's again a slow process, but it's better to do it in small increments rather than trying to force it to do everything you want all at once. Here's Alan. Now I'm rolling the bead into this panel. This is after quite a bit of work on the English wheel, and now I'm tipping the edge of that over. This will eventually be where the wire edge gets tucked into. For those of you who don't know, when I say wire edge, a lot of cars in the 1920s and 1930s had a steel rod that was rolled into the edge of the fender for strength. Anyways, here is the patch panel. It's not ready to be welded in yet because now I have to repair this rear section. You can see it has an oil can, and actually this is after I hammered on it a bunch. You can see just how badly beaten out of shape this is. It's all, I think the edge of the fender must have caught on something and bent back at some point, and then somebody tried beating it back into shape with an axe. So I had roughed it out, but it was still a long ways from being decent. So this ended up being the most difficult area on the Fender to repair. The metal here was badly stretched, so I had to use a shrinking disc, and I'm putting some marker on the surface because it was supposed to help with the shrinking disc galling the surface, but this was a while back, and I have since stopped using permanent marker when I use the shrinking disc because it doesn't seem to make any difference whatsoever. Anyways, this took quite a while, but here's the very sped up version of it. You're welcome. And here it is roughed in, and now I have some more hood dents to fix on here, so we're gonna get those knocked out. And now we are finally ready to start welding in the patch panel that we built. So I start by cutting out the body line area, and now I'm going to weld in that steel rod. So we're going to do an offset joint where the weld on the steel rod is offset from the weld on the exterior sheet metal. Once the reinforcement rod was welded in place, I was able to start getting the patch panel fit into place. Once I'm happy with the fit, I trim everything to size using hand tools as it's more accurate, and the more accurate the patch panel fits, the easier it is to weld. Now I'll begin welding in the patch panel using the TIG welder, and you'll notice I'm doing long continuous passes here. And this is controversial, but the more consistent and the more continuous the weld is, the easier it is to finish and the stronger the repair is. So I try to keep everything as consistent as I can, and then I knock down the weld seam and hammer it back into shape. I use a dolly on the backside to stretch the weld seam, which removes any distortion from welding, and then I'm able to blend out the repair and eventually finish it out by hand using the body file. Now the dies from my bead roller that I used to put the body line in the patch panel were not quite the same shape as the original body line, so I decided to fine-tune that area using some lead. Once I had the lead applied, I then filed it to shape using a body file. It's important to only work lead using hand tools, as trying to shape it with power tools results in an inferior repair that requires modern plastic body filler to smooth it out. I sprayed some green paint on here as a guide coat to help me shape the body line to the required shape that I wanted. And here is the finished product. Now I had to remove the fender once again, but this time the goal was to get some epoxy primer on it so that the metal was protected until I was ready to do some more work on the truck. There was also a little bit more welding and finish work to do. I also had to do a little bit more lead work around the front edge here as it had been cracked, and I welded it, but I didn't want to overwork the metal, so I simply leaded it out. And then here at this back body line edge, which had been causing us all that trouble, I couldn't quite get the body line itself all the way back the way I wanted. There were still some divots in it, so I chose to finish it out with lead. And here we are again filing the lead to the desired shape. And here we are after the lead has been filed. Now I'm applying some 2K epoxy primer here. This stuff comes in an aerosol can, but it is a 2K product. I think it's made by Spray Max. And the idea here was just to get something on the metal so it didn't flash rust while I was working on the rest of the truck. Now I'm dismantling the rest of the truck here and doing a little bit more lead work on the driver's side fender at the front here. Now I was almost out of black epoxy primer, so I had to use some white primer for the first coat here, and then the second coat I did in black. And there's the fender, and now we're off to the junkyard because I need a front axle for the truck. So here I am digging through my garbage, and we found a likely candidate. Now this axle came off a 1953 Chevy Truck, and the reason we are using it is that it is the exact same width as the 36 axle. The spring mounting points are in the exact same spot. The only difference is that the kingpins are more readily available, and it has more modern Bendix brakes on it. So I began carefully dismantling it, and of course discovered that the one spindle was ruined. So upon further investigation, I also discovered that the axle itself is bent. But that was no matter because I still needed the backing plates from this axle for our Bendix brake conversion. Now we're back off to the junkyard again to try and find another axle for the truck. I began investigating my pile of garbage here. That one's ruined. That one's junk. And the only good one is the one that is still in a frame and is buried under all the other garbage and in the snow. Because that's just the way things go around here. So I began relocating all of the garbage on top of it, and then set about spending the next several hours out in the snow extracting the axle. Now this axle was from a 1949. It has the same size kingpins that I need, but the brakes are the older style Huck brakes, so I needed to use the spindles and the axle from this setup, but the brakes we were going to have to swap the backing plates over from the 53 axle. There was one major problem with this axle, and that is the kingpin on the driver's side was badly seized in place, but with the help from a press and some heat, I was finally able to get it out. Now I'm trying to get the steering arm released from the spindle here. As usual, everything is rusted and seized in place. And now I'm pressing out the old bushings here in the spindle so that I can get the new ones pressed in, and here's the mess that we have. Now I'm cleaning up the front leaf springs, and these springs all have a big groove worn in them, and this of course affects the way the spring works, so I went about smoothing out that groove, and this will allow the spring to work properly without binding. I then used the press to de-arch the springs, and this of course revealed a few weak links. Luckily I had two sets of front springs, so I was able to piece together one good set from the two, and then I pressed in new bushings into the spring eyes as well as the frame. Then I began removing the old axle from the truck here. Now this isn't the right axle for the truck. It's just one that I threw under it years ago so I could roll it around easy. And the neat thing about these old vehicles is they have rebuildable tie rod ends. So I wanted to retain that. And of course they're all badly worn. This is supposed to be round and it's ovaled out. We do have a solution for that though coming up. Now I'm planning to keep this truck forever, so one thing I wanted to do was to future-proof it, and by future-proof it I mean try to use as many parts that can be rebuilt and serviced as possible, and try to use as many off-the-shelf, more common, readily available parts as I can without actually detracting from the appearance and feel of the truck. So that was my reason for using the newer axle, is just the kingpins for the 47 to 53 trucks are a lot more readily available and common. Now we're giving everything the old rattle can rebuild here. And then I began assembling the springs. I'm using a spring liner that I got from Speedway Motors. This is supposed to help the spring do spring things, I guess. So the springs got all put together with that and with new center bolts. And once we got everything put together, we were finally ready to start assembling the front end. Now we're ready to install the front axle and make sure we install our caster shims here. These straight axle front ends require more caster than an independent front suspension. I think this one ended up being set at about 5 degrees. This really helps with the drivability of the straight axle. Then we got our spindles and new kingpins and bushings installed. Now when it came to the steering arm, I ran into a bit of an issue. The 1953 steering arm, someone had already drilled out for modern tapered tie rod ends, and I wanted to use the rebuildable tie rod ends, again in the interest of future-proofing the truck. The other issue is that the steering arm itself was kind of not even close to the right shape as the original steering arm, and because I'm using the original steering box, I ended up taking the steering arms off of this 35 axle here, which had the correct geometry for the steering box and the drag length that I was using. So then I set about replacing the ball ends on the steering arms. I chopped them off and pressed out the remnants, and then I pressed in the new ball ends. These are the bolt-in style, but they also press in, so you kind of get the best of both worlds, I guess. And I'm not anticipating any issues with these. These will last a long time as long as I keep everything greased. Now I'm going to finish removing the backing plate from the 53 axle. Again, this was all badly rusted in place. And here's another look at the bad spindle. So, of course, because I'm using 49 spindles now, the 53 backing plates have different size holes on them, so I had to weld them up and re-drill them. And while I was at it, I also went about repairing these surfaces here. This is where the brake shoes ride on, and they had been ground away over the years, so I welded them back up, filed them back smooth so that the brake shoes won't catch on there and the brakes will work properly. Now it was time to begin rebuilding the steering box, and some of this was filmed before I dragged the truck out of the corner here. I kind of wanted to get a head start on it here. And of course, these trucks, you can't use a conventional steering wheel puller on them. So I had to kind of modify the steering wheel slightly so that I could get a puller on it because of course the steering wheel was seized on just like everything else. Now I'm dismantling the steering box here, and for once on this project I got lucky and everything inside the steering box was in remarkably good condition. The only thing I had to replace was the bushings for the pitman arm shaft. So I got new bushings and pounded out the old ones, and once I was done pounding these out, I pressed in the new ones and I froze these in the freezer so that they would press in easier. Next, I replaced the upper steering column bushing, and of course this was a 5-minute job that turned into a 4-hour job. I ended up having to shave down the new bushing in order to get it to fit properly, and it took again several hours to finally get it in there, and then I was able to start reassembling the steering box here. Everything went together well. Now, the old timers say not to use regular grease in these steering boxes because the gears won't be lubricated properly. So they say to use corn head grease, but we can't seem to get that here, or I couldn't find it anywhere. So I found some grease at Napa that had the same rating as corn head grease and put that in there. And then I gave it a quick rattle can rebuild again, and finally we were ready to get it all mounted up in the truck. Now this truck originally had 6-bolt wheels, but the rear axle that I was using for the truck was a 5-bolt pattern, so I had to head out to the junkyard to find a set of 5-bolt hubs for the front because I wanted the wheels to have the same bolt pattern all the way around. Here we are driving through Saskatchewan, and you can see that there's not a whole lot going on, which is just the way I like things. And I was lucky enough to find a donor car for the front hubs, so I was able to remove the hubs from this vehicle here and got them home and got them all cleaned up, and I started assembling the front end here, getting the backing plates and steering arms in place. Everything got all new grade 8 bolts here, and we used lock nuts with red Loctite because I don't know about you folks, but I kind of don't want any of this stuff to loosen off on me. And the one thing I've noticed with these old vehicles is things tend to loosen off, so I always try to use red Loctite and lock washers and lock nuts where applicable. Now we're putting our tie rod ends back together. Now I'm pressing new wheel studs into the hubs here, and you're certainly not giving away wheel studs anymore. And of course, I decided to restore the original dust caps. So we set about hammering those all back straight again. I don't know what it is, but for some reason people always reinstall their dust caps using an axe, and they end up getting pretty beat up over the years. So we got a quick coat of paint, and now the truck has steering for the first time in who knows how many years. Now I'm painting the wheels. I went with a 16-inch steel wheel, and I think they're 16 by 5 on the front and 16 by 6 on the rear, or maybe they're 16 by 4.5 on the front. I can't quite remember. I did find another fatigue crack on the floor here, so we're drilling the ends of it and then TIG welding it up. And now I'm mounting the tires, and I had to do all this myself because, as I've discovered in the past, tire shops no longer know how to mount tube tires without wrecking the tube. So I figured I can wreck the tube myself, and so we're struggling here to get the tires mounted, but we did eventually get them mounted, and they seem to be holding air so far. Wanted to give a big thank you to one of our viewers over in France. His name is Laurent, and he goes by Brick Tavern on YouTube here, but he sent me an extremely generous donation that I used to purchase the tires for this truck, so thank you again. The original steering column mounting bracket was missing from this truck, so I decided to modify this gauge panel that I had built for a car years ago. I began by dismantling it and then test fitting it in place here, and I had to do a fair amount of surgery on it in order to get it to, I guess, conform to my needs. Now, I didn't have a 36 truck column drop, but I did have the steering column drop for a 1935 Chevy Standard, so I welded that into one of the holes on this panel here, and then I built a reinforcement piece to help brace it. Here we see the reinforcement piece being fitted in place to the backside of this panel here, and the U-bolt assembly is all part of the 1935 Chevy column drop, so this will sandwich the steering column in place when we're done. And now we're welding everything in place here and re-welding the sides of the old gauge panel. Now, the original 1936 truck gauges were destroyed beyond repair, so I'm going to be fitting a set of Stuart Warner wings gauges. Now, these are kind of a cheesy reproduction of a gauge that was popular in the 1940s and 1950s, and in order to fit them onto the truck, I had to build an adapter panel here, so this is what I'm working on right now. Now, these aftermarket gauges are smaller diameter than the original 36 gauge, and they were looking a little bit lost in the dash. So in order to help tie everything together, I took the trim rings off of the original gauges, and then I found some cream colored paint that matched the original 36 gauge face, and I painted the adapter panel with that. And here's the column drop, and it's going in the truck for what's hopefully the last time. The two extra holes in there are going to be holding gauges as well, so we'll have a full set of gauges in this truck that hopefully work. And here I'm installing the trim rings, and now we're getting the gauge panel installed here, and I'm fairly pleased with how it all worked out. Obviously, the ideal thing would be to restore the original gauges, but it simply wasn't in the budget, and I probably don't care all that much. We're nearing the point of being ready for an engine to go in this, so I began the process by polishing up the original paint on the firewall, and as with any proper polishing job, you always start by beating the surface up with a hammer. Then we moved on to cleaning the surface with wax and or grease remover, and then from there we cleaned it with soapy water, and I wet sanded the surface with 3000 grit just to take any of the scum off, and here I am polishing it up with the buffing wheel. Now there was a bunch of little fiddly things that had to be done, so I started with the license plate bracket. This is the original taillight assembly and license plate bracket for the truck, but it was badly bent out of shape, so I set about straightening it using a variety of caveman-inspired techniques. This truck originally came with only one tail light, but let's be honest, modern motorists barely have a room temperature IQ, and if you use hand signals, they think you're just making gestures at them. So I wanted to have dual tail lights, and I had a set of 1937 Ford passenger car tail lights sitting around, so I decided to use them because I like the way that they look. In order to adapt these taillights to mount them on the truck, I had to build some brackets, and these brackets aren't exactly going to be putting Project Binky out of business anytime soon, but they serve the purpose of mounting the taillights, and they are largely invisible. Next up, I needed a tailgate, and a reproduction tailgate cost upwards of $500. And in 1936, these tailgates did not have a Chevrolet script on them, they were just plain tailgates. And so I decided that it was simple enough that I could simply build one myself, and so that's what I did. And I think we only had a few dollars worth of materials in here and a little bit of time, and we had a reproduction 36 Chevy tailgate. Now, back in 1936, you could actually tell the difference between a Chevy, a Dodge, and a Ford just by looking at them. So it wasn't necessary for the manufacturer to plaster their logo over every single square inch of the vehicle. Now, originally this tailgate would have been rolled out of one piece, but I don't have the technology to do that, so I'm using round tubing and welding it onto the flat section, and with a little bit of putty and a little bit of paint, no one will know the difference. Next, I needed to build the latch bracket thingy for the chain hook to fit into. So I just built that out of some steel plate and drilled it out. And then I made some fake rivets using carriage bolts. And then I kind of welded the whole mess together and then plug welded them in place. And again, I used those carriage bolts to make it look like it had been riveted in place as it would have been from factory. Next up, I had to fill the fuel filler neck hole in the cab, and I started with the metal interior panel. And I forgot to mention, but this cab came off of a 1.5 ton grain truck, but the rest of the truck is now all half ton, and the half tons in 1936 had the gas tank mounted underneath the bed, so I wanted to put that back to the proper location for a half ton, so I needed to fill the fuel filler neck hole in the cab. Now when it came time to fill the hole on the exterior of the cab, I wanted to retain as much of the original paint as I could, and in order to do that I had to keep the repair as small as possible, which meant kind of botching the repair, but as long as this is sealed up from the back it will last a very long time. Now it's time for the engine and transmission and rear axle to go in, and in keeping with the theme of wanting something that I could get parts for, I decided to go with the most common engine and transmission probably ever built. For the engine, I bought a complete donor vehicle. This vehicle is an Omega Seville, which was a vehicle that was only available in Western Canada. But a lot of people don't know this, but the Omega Seville used an all Chevy drivetrain. So we were able to get the Chevy V8, the turbo 350 transmission, and the 10-bolt rear axle from this car. As stylish as they are, the Omega Seville has really no value here in Canada, and so I was able to pick this car up for extremely cheap. Of course, I don't believe in wasting anything, so once I was finished pulling the drivetrain, I put another rear axle under the car, moved it outside, boarded up the windows, and converted it into a shed for my lawnmower. Here I am removing the windshield frame so I can get a new windshield cut for it. And what you saw me doing previously was mocking up the engine and transmission and the rear axle. And then I blew it all back apart again so I could finish weld all the mounting brackets. Nice thing about this setup is I don't have to cut or butcher or weld anything on the frame or the body. It's all 100% bolt together. So if somebody wanted to, they could put this truck back to 100% original in about a week's worth of work. Not that anyone would ever do that. The problem is that all the original parts that were missing from this truck are mostly 1936 only, so I would have to buy another complete truck and destroy that truck to put this truck back to original. And if you're destroying a vehicle that's more complete and better than the one you started with, then you're probably working on the wrong vehicle. So this is a way that I could save this truck and put it back on the road and have something that I can drive every day and get parts for. Here I am building the battery tray. It fits in the stock location, and now I'm doing some sound deadener on the inside of the doors. So what you saw me doing there was building a new floor pan and a mounting point for the shifter, as well as installing the new gas tank. Now I'm rebuilding the carburetor and we're getting very close to firing this truck up for the first time. The carburetor was very dirty and plugged up, so it took a fair amount of cleaning to get all the garbage out of it. While the carburetor was soaking, I began building new fuel lines, and normally building fuel lines and brake lines is one of my least favorite parts of working on a vehicle, but I bought a tubing straightener as well as an Eastwood flaring tool, and those two tools made it much easier to build brake lines and transmission lines and fuel lines for this truck. Next, I started building a new exhaust system, and I was starting to get quite impatient at this point and wanted to hear the truck run. So I only built an exhaust basically just up to right past the mufflers, and just so that the truck wasn't too loud, but there was still a fair amount of finishing that needed to be done. After the exhaust, I began wiring the truck. I bought a universal 12 circuit wiring harness, and I didn't make you watch me do that, but eventually we got it all plugged together. We do now have lights, headlights, yes. After what was probably the first drive in over 60 years, we set about finishing out the truck so that I could actually legally drive it on the street. As anyone who's worked on these old vehicles before knows, the easy part is making them run. The hard part is making them into a functional roadworthy vehicle. This is where the real work begins, and unfortunately, we only had a few weeks before the snow was going to fly, and my goal was to have this truck on the road before then, so we really had to start hustling. Began finishing up all the various little things. Here I am cleaning all the old insulation out of the cab so that I can clean it and paint it and put new sound deadener in place. And this is some ASMR nonsense. Apparently people enjoy this. So here you go. Yeah, I don't get it, but anybody who enjoys that kind of thing, I got a whole yard full of vehicles that need a lot of scraping and cleaning and vacuuming and what have you, and you're more than welcome to come dig through the mouse nest and old asbestos insulation anytime you like. Now we're ready to start painting the inside of the cab here. So we mix up our paint and manage not to spill it everywhere. And now we're just painting a happy little cab. These cabs were all bare metal inside originally, so I figure whatever garbage paint I put on it is better than factory. Next, it was time to start assembling the doors, and this turned into a huge project. As it turns out, everything was broken garbage, and I also never took these doors apart, so I didn't have any idea how they all went back together. So here I am repairing the broken window regulator for the driver's side. Luckily, I had a 1935 window regulator for parts, but it was different slightly in how it mounts as to the 36 regulator, so I took the good parts from the 35 regulator and spliced them into the 36 regulator. So I had to change the windy thing as well as the main gear. Later on, I discovered that the window regulator from a 1937 to 1946 truck will bolt right in, and it's a much better design than this design here. But I was able to get this to work as well as I could make it work, but I think I will keep an eye out for the newer style regulator so that I can upgrade that. And now we are cleaning up the interior components. And now finally we are ready to start assembling the doors. This was a long time coming and one of those jobs that I had been putting off forever because it was quite a hassle. Everything, like I said, was broken and fatigued and wrecked and ripped apart, and so it took a fair amount of work to get all of this back together and functioning again. Now the inner window or door opening handle had the mounting thing ripped off of it, so I had to patch that up on the driver's side, and here we are assembling the rest of the door. Here I am changing the inner seal on the door panel here. This rubs up against the glass and does some method of sealing it, I guess. And now we are testing out the window, and you can see it works with our cobbled together window regulator. Here's the painted inside of the cab, and we're now ready to start installing the sound deadener. Now, being the self-proclaimed genius that I am, I did not purchase enough sound deadener to cover the entire inside of the cab, but I was able to get enough down that I could start installing the metal interior panels, and the inside of the roof had to wait until I was able to order more sound deadener. And here we are installing the metal interior panels. This I fast forwarded through, but this took the better part of way longer than I wanted to spend on it. Everything was bent and twisted out of shape, and again, I hadn't removed any of it originally, so I didn't really have any idea of how it was supposed to go back together. But unlike my life, I was eventually able to get it all back together. By the time I got this all reassembled, the rest of the sound deadener had arrived, and I was able to get the inside of the roof coated, and now we were in a huge rush to get this truck on the road. It was only going to be a couple more weeks of decent weather before the snow hit. So here I am stripping the inside of the front fenders to get some paint on there. I also wanted to get them rocker guarded, but I simply ran out of time, but we will be rocker guarding them later on in the video. Here we are doing a quickie rattle can paint job just to get something on the metal so that I could drive the truck for a little bit. Later on, I get to sand all this back off. I'm truly, really quite good at making more work for the future Kyle. Next, I began cobbling some kind of a seat together. This seat came out of a 1960 Chevy Truck, and I narrowed it as you saw previously in the video. And now I'm just getting some foam and burlap on here so that I have something to sit on besides metal springs. Then I installed a cheap seat cover. This is only temporary, but the one benefit of this horrible seat cover is that my cats absolutely love the headrest covers that came with it. The price of the seat cover, in my opinion, was completely worth it because it made my cats happy. Next up, we began throwing the truck together, and here we are getting everything ready to put the fenders and the hood back on, and I tried installing the hood by myself, which was extremely difficult, and this is why I don't have nice things. We're now literally days away from winter arriving here, so the race was on to get everything put back together because I wanted to put a couple miles on this truck before I blew it all back apart again to finish it out. It's kind of nice when you're not working around fresh paint and you can kind of work out all the little mechanical bugs as you're driving it. I also wanted to get this truck on the road so that my dad would have a chance to drive it for the first time. He knew I had been working on this truck, but he hadn't seen it yet in person since I had done a bunch of work to it, and it was always kind of his dream to be able to drive the truck and see it on the road. So I was doing my best here to try and make that happen. Now, I had never gotten around to ordering a glove box liner for this truck, so this one was donated to us by Shane. So thanks Shane for helping us out with the project, and now we have a glove box. Now, this Chevrolet emblem had been missing, and when I first started my YouTube channel, one of our viewers, Tom S., had mailed me in a set of new Chevrolet emblems. Thanks, Tom. And now we're going to cut to my dad inspecting his old truck.
Yeah, it looks good. Should we take it around the block?
Yeah, you can go wherever you want with it.
Well, I'm not going to go too far, but... I bet you could probably let those rear tires loose if you had to, eh? That's solid. I mean, it's... haven't heard a lane departure warning yet, so...
No.
These trucks were not made to be highway driven at 110 kilometers an hour either. They were driven back and forth to the farm. Definitely driven worse. Drive around a bit more? Or?
Yeah, go for it.
It's not bad for noise considering it.
Well, I definitely got to finish the exhaust.
Yeah. But I mean, everything seems to work. Transmission works.
Yeah.
No, it's good. Awesome. 45 years in the making, eh?
Yeah. No, I wish I could say the story ends here, but there's still a great deal of work left to do on this truck before we can call it done. So I drove it like this for a week or two until the snow hit, and then the truck got pulled back in the garage and I started finishing out the exhaust system. I wanted the exhaust to exit out the rear of the truck, so here I am cobbling together some kind of an exhaust. Next up, I needed to install some wood in the bed, and for that I got the wood from a 100-year-old Eaton's farmhouse package that had never been assembled. Now somebody had already planed the wood and cut the grooves into it, so here I am chopping down the wood to fit into the bed of the 36. Then I went out to the junk pile again and got some metal divider strips. And after a fair amount of hunting and foraging, I was able to find a set that were usable. So I brought them inside and began fitting the wood into the bed of the truck. And then I started cutting down the divider strips so that they would fit. I then bolted everything together to make sure it would all fit, and then took the truck out for one last drive out in the snow before we got serious about finishing it. The original vacuum wiper motor assembly was badly damaged, so I found an electric wiper motor for a Jeep, and with a little bit of help from a homemade adapter kit, I was able to get it installed in the truck, and we got it all wired in, and it seemed to fit okay, but the only problem is the original cover would not fit over it, so I set about building a new cover because I didn't want to cut up the original metal cover. Got everything reassembled and then gave it an old trial run here, and it appears to work. And the final test was to make sure that the wiper would allow the factory AC to still function, and it looks like it does. So total success there. And now we get to begin tearing the whole truck apart again so that we can do some painting on it. Now these bedsides ended up being in a little bit worse shape than I thought. So after fiddling around with them with the hammer and dolly and the shrinking disc for the better part of a couple days, I finally phoned it in and got out the old plastic body filler and began smearing it on. I wasn't trying to get these lasers straight. The goal was just to fill in and smooth out any of the hammer marks and shrinking marks and 90 years of severe abuse. I really wanted to still retain the character of the truck and not make it into some perfect and precious thing. So I was okay with some flaws, but just not, glaring, obvious damage. So we got these all smoothed out, the best that I cared to, which wasn't very good, but good enough. And there's Alan again. And now we're tearing the box sides off of here so that we can get them in primer. Once I had the bed sides set up, I went ahead and primed them using polyester high build primer, and then I block sanded the primer all smooth. And once that was all block sanded out, I sealed everything with epoxy primer. I applied 2 coats of epoxy primer, let it set up, and now we're ready to start painting. And I wanted to give a big shout out to Ideal Auto Paint Solutions in Saskatoon for giving me an awesome deal on the paint and doing an excellent job of matching the original green paint on the truck. If you're in the Saskatoon area and you need paint or body shop supplies, make sure you head on over to Ideal Auto Paint Solutions. Thanks again, and now we're ready to start painting. And I just wanted to let everybody know that I am not a painter. I have almost no experience whatsoever painting. And so I wanted to thank Scott over at Cold War Motors for giving me a few tips on how I could get the job done. If you're not already subscribed to Cold War Motors, I highly recommend that you do. It is an excellent channel. Now, my vision for this truck was never to make it into some flawless showpiece. I wanted something that I could drive, and I also wanted it to resemble what an old farm truck that was well taken care of might have looked like when it was 15 to 20 years old. So for the fenders, I decided to brush paint them. Yes, that's right. I am brush painting the fenders and running boards on the truck. And the reason, again, for that is that I wanted something that looked old and I wanted it to look presentable, but I didn't want it to be totally perfect. So after I applied the paint with a brush, I gave it a quick wet sand and polish just to take any dust out of it. And from a distance, it looks presentable, and up close, you can still tell that it was brush painted, but I'm very happy with how it all turned out. Of course, it only took me about 10 minutes to remove these side aprons and the rear fenders, and now that they're painted, it took me the better part of an entire day to reinstall them. Of course, I didn't make you watch the entire thing in glorious detail because it would have put you to sleep, so here's just a sped up summary. When I was a kid, I went to a garage sale with my grandma, and they had this license plate there, and I don't know why I needed or wanted it, but my grandma bought this for me, and it's been hanging out here ever since. But I think I finally found a place where it can go. I figure this truck doesn't look a whole lot different from how a well-used farm truck might have looked back in 1951. And here is a look at the completed truck, and I gotta say I am extremely pleased with how it came out. I had a vision in my head when I started this project, and this is exactly what I had in my head, so it's pretty cool to see it all together now. It just looks like a nice old farm truck. I didn't want it to be totally perfect. I wanted to be able to drive it and enjoy it. Like my dad said, this has been 45 years in the making now, and so I really hope this video inspires somebody out there to pick up where they left off on their stalled project. Hey, I just wanted to give a big thank you to any of you out there who took time out of your day to watch this video all the way through. I've got about 5 days now into putting this video together, not to mention probably about a year of continuous labor to put this truck together. So it's greatly appreciated that you would take time to watch this. I realize it's not Hollywood quality, but every time somebody watches this video all the way through, YouTube pays me a few pennies, and I use those pennies to fund some of the other projects we got going on here. I've got a garage and a whole backyard full of projects that are even more ambitious than this one, and I'm slowly working my way through them. Just a one-man show here, but I'm doing the best I can, so it does mean a lot to me that you would take the time to watch this. My future plans for this truck are to simply drive the wheels off of it. I'm very happy with how it turned out, and I'm very happy with the way the truck drives and performs. The only thing that I will change on it is I would like to get the seat upholstered. That's not a project for this year, that'll be next year. But other than that, the truck is exactly the way that I want it. I'd also like to extend another big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon, as well as the folks who have sent in a donation via PayPal or the super chat thingy here on YouTube, and everyone who's bought a t-shirt from our store. All of the funds that we get from that go back into these projects here, and we've got no shortage of them. So thank you to all of you again. It is greatly appreciated. I'm going to sign off now, and we'll be back soon with more massive projects.